I was born to light, but I learned to live in darkness. That's the strange irony of my story, isn't it? Most people spend their lives trying to escape the shadows, trying to find their way into the sun. But me? I walked willingly into the depths of eternal night, into a place where the sun had never once touched the earth, where even hope seemed like a foreign concept brought in by foolish travelers who didn't know any better. The Vale of Noct Haven. That's what they called it on the maps, though most maps tried to pretend it didn't exist at all. Nestled between mountains so tall they seemed to scrape holes in the sky. The valley lived in perpetual twilight, illuminated only by the twin moons that hung overhead like two unblinking eyes. The pale one, Selith, and the blue one, Morith. They cast their cold light over everything, turning the world into shades of silver and sapphire, a place that felt more like a painting than reality. I was 23 when the Monastery of Sacred Roots sent me there. Young, yes, but I'd already spent 8 years studying botanical mysteries, plants that defied conventional understanding. The monastery had raised me since I was a child, after my parents died in a plague that swept through the southern provinces. The monks taught me that every living thing has a purpose, a reason for existing, even in the strangest of circumstances. They taught me patience, observation, and most importantly, they taught me that some of the most beautiful things in the world grow in the darkest places. They had no idea how right they were, though not in the way they intended. The assignment came on a cold morning in early autumn. Brother Aldrich, the head of our botanical division, called me to his study. He was ancient, that man, with a beard that reached his chest and eyes that had seen so many seasons. They seemed to contain weather patterns of their own. He told me that there were reports of unique flora in Noct Haven. Plants that bloomed without sunlight, that drew their life from moonlight and minerals deep in the earth. The monastery wanted documentation, samples if possible, research that could expand our understanding of how life adapts to extreme conditions. I accepted without hesitation. Adventure called to me then in a way it doesn't anymore. I packed my journals, my collection tools, my pressed flower albums, my charcoal pencils. I remember thinking that this assignment would make my career, that I'd return with discoveries that would put my name in the botanical archives for generations to come. I had no idea that I'd return with something else entirely. A different kind of archive, written in scar tissue and silence. The journey took 2 weeks. First by carriage through the lowlands, then by horse through the foothills, and finally on foot through the mountain passes. My guide was a grizzled old tracker named Maren, who spoke exactly 17 words the entire trip. Most of them were warnings about not straying from the path after dark. When we finally descended into the valley itself, even he seemed unsettled, which should have told me something. The temperature dropped the moment we crossed into Noct Haven proper. Not gradually, the way it usually does in mountains, but suddenly, like stepping through a curtain. The air tasted different too, mineral and old, like breathing in the exhalation of the earth itself. And the silence. Gods, the silence. No birds, no insects, just the whisper of wind through the strange pale grass that covered the valley floor. Maren left me at the edge of the valley with a nod and a look that I interpreted as sympathy at the time. Now, I think it might have been recognition, the kind you give someone when you know they're about to learn a lesson that can only be learned through pain. The monastery had arranged for me to stay at a small botanical station, a stone building that had been built decades ago by previous researchers. It was simple but functional, with a laboratory, a bedroom, a kitchen, and walls thick enough to keep out the perpetual cold. I spent my first week settling in, taking preliminary samples, mapping out the locations of the most interesting specimens. That's when I first learned about the castle. It wasn't hidden exactly. You could see it from almost anywhere in the valley, perched on a cliff face on the western edge, carved partially from the mountain itself. Black stone, towers that seemed to pierce the sky, windows that glowed with warm amber light when the moons were at their highest. The locals, the few dozen humans who lived in the scattered cottages throughout the valley, they didn't talk about it much. But when they did, they spoke in whispers, with a mixture of fear and something else. Respect, maybe, or resignation. They told me that Lord Theron lived there. The Master of Noct Haven, they called him. Some said he'd been there for 100 years. Others claimed it was longer. They said he was the reason the valley existed at all, that his presence somehow sustained the delicate balance that allowed anything to live in this sunless place. They said he was dangerous, beautiful, and completely untouchable. They said he was a vampire. I should have been terrified. Any reasonable person would have been, but I'd spent my life studying things that shouldn't exist, plants that defied nature's rules, and I'd learned that impossible was just a word people used when they didn't understand something yet. Besides, Lord Theron had never bothered the researchers who came to study the valley. He kept to his castle, they kept to their work, and everyone maintained a careful, respectful distance. That's how it had always been. That's how it should have stayed. I saw him for the first time exactly 2 weeks after my arrival. I'd been collecting samples of night bloom moss near the cliffs, working by moonlight with my specially designed lanterns when I felt it, the sensation of being watched. Not the paranoid feeling you get when you're alone in the dark, but something else. The certainty that someone's attention was focused on you with an intensity that made the air feel heavier. I turned around, and he was there, just standing at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 30 feet away, perfectly still in a way that no living thing should be still. He wore black, of course, layers of it that seemed to absorb the moonlight rather than reflect it. His hair was dark, falling just past his shoulders, and his face ... I'd seen beautiful people before. The monastery was in the capital. I'd seen nobles and diplomats and artists. But Theron's beauty was different. It wasn't warm or inviting or even particularly human. It was the beauty of a blade, sharp and cold and purposeful. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, lips that seemed carved rather than grown. And his eyes, even from that distance, I could see them. Pale, almost silver, catching the moonlight like a cat's eyes do, but with an intelligence behind them that made my breath catch. He didn't speak. He just looked at me for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked away, his movements fluid and precise, and he was gone between one heartbeat and the next. I stood there for a long time after, my collection basket forgotten at my feet, my heart hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might break through. That should have been it. A single encounter, a strange moment to record in my journal and occasionally remember. But it wasn't. He started appearing more often after that. Never close, never threatening, just there, watching me work. I'd be examining a specimen of shadowthorn, and I'd feel that weight of attention. And when I looked up, there he'd be, standing on a distant outcropping. Or I'd be returning to the station at dawn, and I'd catch a glimpse of him on the castle battlements, a dark figure against the lighter stone. After the 3rd week, I started to wonder if maybe it wasn't random, if maybe he was curious about what I was doing. The thought was thrilling in a way I couldn't quite explain to myself. Here was this ancient, powerful being, and he was interested in my work. In me. I began to notice things. Small things. The path to my favorite collection site would be cleared of fallen branches, as if someone had walked it before me. Once, I dropped my favorite sketching pencil near the castle grounds, and the next day it was sitting on the stone wall of the station, perfectly placed where I couldn't miss it. Another time I was struggling to reach a specimen growing on a high cliff face, and when I returned the next evening, I found that someone had driven pitons into the rock, creating a safe climbing path. I never saw him do any of these things, but I knew. Of course it was him. Who else would have noticed? Who else would have cared? I started leaving things for him in return. Small offerings, I suppose you could call them. A particularly beautiful specimen of moon-petal fern placed on the castle's outer wall. A sketch I'd done of the valley at moonrise, weighted down with a stone so the wind wouldn't take it. A small jar of preserved luminescent beetles I'd found, their glow lasting even in death. The offerings were always gone by the next evening. It became a language between us, unspoken but understood. Or at least, I thought it was understood. I thought we were communicating something meaningful, building something fragile and precious in the spaces between his appearances and my offerings. I was so stupid. 2 months into my stay, I finally worked up the courage to approach the castle directly. It was late evening, the moons at their apex, and I'd just finished documenting a particularly rare find. A species of cave lily that I'd never seen referenced in any botanical text. I was exhilarated, riding high on discovery, and before I could talk myself out of it, I found myself walking up the long stone path that led to his gates. They were open. That surprised me. I'd expected them to be locked, forbidding, but they stood wide, as if inviting anyone brave or foolish enough to enter. Beyond them, I could see a courtyard, meticulously maintained despite the strange climate, with carefully cultivated specimens of the valley's most beautiful plants. Someone had spent years creating this garden, understanding exactly what each species needed to thrive. I called out, my voice sounding too small in that vast space, announcing myself as Alara from the botanical monastery, asking if I might speak with the lord of the castle. He appeared at the top of the courtyard stairs, and for the first time I heard his voice. He told me that he knew who I was, that the entire valley knew I was there. His voice was exactly what I'd imagined in my fevered late-night thoughts. Smooth, cultured, with an accent I couldn't quite place. Old, definitely old, the kind of speech pattern that comes from centuries of practice. He asked me what I wanted, and I found myself babbling about my research, about the incredible specimens I'd found, about how grateful I was for the cleared paths and the returned pencil. He listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. Those pale eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made me feel like I was being read, page by page, every secret and hope laid bare. When I finally ran out of words, he simply told me that I was welcome to continue my research, that the valley was large enough for both of us, and that I should feel free to use the castle gardens for my studies if I wished. Then he invited me inside for tea. Tea. Such a mundane word for such an extraordinary moment. I followed him through halls that seemed to stretch into infinity, lined with paintings and tapestries that probably cost more than the monastery's entire annual budget. He led me to a library, a room so vast it made our own collection look like a personal bookshelf, with volumes stacked floor to ceiling, rolling ladders on every wall, and furniture that looked like it had been crafted by masters centuries ago. He poured tea from a delicate pot, his movements precise and controlled, and he asked me about my work. Really asked, with genuine interest, questions that showed he understood botany far better than most humans ever would. He told me about the valley's history, how it had existed in this strange twilight state for as long as anyone could remember, how the plants here had evolved in complete isolation from the outside world. He explained that he'd been maintaining the gardens for longer than I'd been alive, that he found peace in the slow, patient work of cultivation. We talked for hours, or rather, I talked and he listened, occasionally offering insights that took my breath away with their depth of understanding. He told me about specimens I hadn't found yet, locations where rare varieties grew, techniques for preserving samples that would maintain their properties even after death. His knowledge was encyclopedic, accumulated over what must have been centuries of observation. When I finally left that night, walking back to my station in a daze, I felt like I'd just experienced the most intellectually stimulating evening of my entire life. But more than that, I felt seen, truly seen, in a way I'd never experienced before. He'd listened to my passion, my excitement, my theories, and he hadn't dismissed them or patronized me or treated me like a child playing at scholarship. He'd engaged with me as an equal. I was hooked. After that night, the invitations became regular. Once a week, then twice, then almost every evening. I'd finish my day's work and make my way to the castle. And we'd spend hours in that library, or walking through his gardens, or occasionally in what he called his study, a smaller, more intimate room filled with astronomical instruments and charts of the night sky. He never touched me. Not once, not even a hand on my shoulder or a brush of fingers. But somehow, that made everything more intense. Every word felt weighted with meaning. Every glance seemed to contain volumes of unspoken communication. When he looked at me, really looked at me, I felt like I was the only thing in existence, like the entire universe had narrowed down to that moment, that exchange. I started to notice other things too. The way he'd sometimes pause mid-sentence when I entered a room, as if he needed a moment to compose himself. The way his eyes would track my movements, following me with an attention that felt almost hungry. Once, I caught him looking at my throat, and the expression on his face made my pulse race in ways I didn't want to examine too closely. I began to interpret everything through the lens of developing feeling. When he told me that my heartbeat was loud in the quiet halls, I thought he meant that he was aware of my presence in a way that mattered to him. When he mentioned that I'd become a fixture in his evening routine, I believed he meant that he'd come to depend on my company. When he said that the castle felt less empty with me there, I convinced myself that he was admitting to loneliness, to a connection forming between us. I crafted an entire narrative in my head. The ancient vampire, alone for so long, finally finding someone who understood him. The young researcher, brilliant but isolated, discovering a kindred spirit in the most unexpected place. It was romantic, tragic, beautiful. It was the kind of story that belonged in the books I'd read as a girl. Fairy tales, where the monster and the maiden find in each other what the rest of the world couldn't give them. I was writing fiction, and I didn't even realize it. 4 months in, I made a discovery that I knew would be my masterpiece. Deep in a cave system at the far end of the valley, growing in conditions that should have made life impossible, I found them, moonshade lilies. I'd read about them in exactly one text, an ancient botanical manuscript that most scholars dismissed as mythology. They were said to bloom once every century, on the night when both moons aligned perfectly in the sky. Their petals supposedly held properties that could preserve life, heal wounds that should be fatal, even grant visions of the future in the hands of someone who knew how to prepare them correctly. And I'd found an entire grove of them, buds just beginning to form, timing suggesting they'd bloom in exactly 2 weeks. I spent every spare moment tending to them, studying them, documenting every stage of their development. The cave became my second home, and I barely slept, afraid I'd miss some crucial transformation. But more than the scientific significance, I knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to bring one to Theron, a gift, not like the small offerings I'd left before, but something truly meaningful. Something that showed I understood the magnitude of what was developing between us, even if we'd never spoken it aloud. The bloom of a moonshade lily for the Lord of Eternal Night. It was perfect, poetic, exactly the kind of gesture that would communicate everything I felt but didn't know how to say. The night of the bloom arrived with perfect conditions. Both moons hung full and heavy in the sky, their light combining into something almost bright enough to read by. I spent 6 hours in that cave, watching as the buds slowly unfurled, revealing petals that seemed to contain their own light source, a soft silver glow that pulsed like a heartbeat. When the largest lily was fully open, I carefully cut it, wrapping the stem in wet cloth to preserve it, cradling it like the precious thing it was. I'd spent 3 days preparing a presentation, practicing what I'd say, how I'd explain what this meant both botanically and personally. I'd even allowed myself to imagine how he might react, the careful control slipping for just a moment. Maybe a smile, a real one, not the polite expressions he usually wore. I walked to the castle with my heart in my throat, the lily protected in a specially designed case I'd constructed. It was late, well past midnight, but I knew he'd be awake. He was always awake at this hour, and he'd told me I was welcome any time. The castle gates were open, as they usually were for me now. I made my way through the familiar corridors, heading toward the great hall where I knew he often held court with his household. I could hear voices as I approached, which wasn't unusual. Theron had retainers, other vampires who served him, though I rarely interacted with them. They kept their distance from me, whether out of respect for him or disdain for humans. I'd never been quite sure. I should have announced myself. Looking back, that's clear. But I was so excited, so eager to share this moment, that I just kept walking, following the sound of his voice. I heard him before I saw him. That smooth, cultured tone that I'd come to know so well. He was saying something about curiosity, about how it was an interesting quality to observe. Then another voice, female, amused in a way that made my steps slow. She was asking him about the human girl, the one who kept showing up, if he ever got tired of the constant presence. I should have turned around then, should have walked away, but I didn't. I stood there in the shadowed hallway, just out of sight of the great hall's entrance, and I listened. Theron responded, and I could hear something in his voice I'd never heard before. Not warmth, not the careful engagement he always used with me. This was casual, almost bored. He told his companion that I was curious, yes, persistent, certainly. He said that I reminded him of a small bird that had once nested in the castle eaves, always chirping, always fluttering about, always there. The female laughed and asked if I was bothersome, and that's when he said it. He told her that bothersome wasn't quite the right word, more like ... an echo, he said. A sound that repeats long after the original noise has faded, one that you notice but don't necessarily listen to. Something that fills space but doesn't really add anything to it. He said I was persistent. He'd give me that, but persistence wasn't the same as significance. Someone else spoke then, a male voice I didn't recognize, suggesting that perhaps I'd developed feelings beyond mere scholarly interest. The tone was mocking, and I heard several others laugh. Theron's response was worse than agreement would have been. He simply said that what I felt or didn't feel was irrelevant to him, that human emotions were like mayfly lives, brief, intense, and ultimately inconsequential to beings who measured time in centuries. He told them that I was a temporary fixture, like all the researchers before me, and that when I eventually left, he likely wouldn't remember me within a few years. That's how it always went with humans, he explained. They came, they studied, they left, and the valley remained unchanged. The female asked if he'd ever told me any of this directly, and he said there was no need. He'd been perfectly polite. He'd allowed me access to his resources. He'd treated me with the same courtesy he'd extend to any guest. If I'd built something more than that in my head, well, that was the human tendency to create narratives where none existed. It wasn't his responsibility to manage my interpretations. Someone asked if he was concerned I'd become a problem, and his response was so dismissive it felt like a physical blow. He said that humans didn't become problems, not really. They were too fragile, too temporary. I'd finish my research and return to my monastery, and that would be that. And if I did cause some minor issue before leaving, well, there were ways to handle such things. Ways that didn't require much effort on his part. They all laughed at that. A shared joke I wasn't part of, had never been part of, would never be part of. I don't remember deciding to move. My body acted without permission from my brain, backing away from the doorway, each step careful and silent in a way I didn't know I was capable of. The lily's case felt impossibly heavy in my hands. This precious thing I'd spent weeks cultivating. This gesture I'd built entire dreams around. I made it out of the castle without anyone seeing me. Or maybe they saw and just didn't care. Maybe I'd been visible all along, and that was somehow worse than being invisible. The walk back to the station should have taken 20 minutes. I have no idea how long it actually took. Time felt broken, unreliable, like everything else I'd thought was solid. I kept replaying his words in my head, hearing them in different tones, trying to find some interpretation that didn't mean what it clearly meant. An echo, a temporary fixture, irrelevant. When I finally reached the station, I looked down at the lily case I'd been clutching the entire time. Through the glass, I could see that the bloom had already started to wilt. Moonshade lilies, for all their legendary properties, are fragile once cut. They need to be in soil, in their proper environment, or they die within hours. I'd known that. I'd spent weeks documenting that exact process. But somehow, I'd convinced myself that this one would be different. That my careful preservation would be enough, that the strength of my intention would somehow override basic botanical fact. I was wrong about that too. I opened the case and lifted out the lily. Even wilting, even dying, it was still beautiful. The petals had lost some of their glow, but they still shimmered in the moonlight, silver turning to gray, luminescence fading to shadow. I held it in my hands and watched it die. Really watched it, documenting every stage with the clinical precision I'd been trained to employ. The way the petals curled inward, protecting the stamen even as they collapsed, the way the stem softened, unable to support the weight of the bloom, the way the glow didn't extinguish all at once but faded slowly, reluctantly, like it was trying to hold on to existence for as long as possible. It took 4 hours for the lily to die completely. By the time the last hint of luminescence flickered out, the moons had begun their descent toward the horizon, and the sky was starting to lighten from black to the deep purple that passed for pre-dawn in Noctaven. I didn't cry. That's the strange thing. I thought I would, thought I'd fall apart completely, but my eyes stayed dry. Maybe shock. Maybe I'd simply run out of the capacity for that kind of release. Or maybe, on some level I didn't want to acknowledge, I'd always known. Maybe I'd been performing grief in advance, preparing for the inevitable moment when fantasy crashed into reality. I buried the lily in the garden behind the station. Not because it deserved ceremony, but because that's what you do with dead things. You put them in the ground, and you mark the spot, and you move on. The sun set that evening on a version of me that was fundamentally different from the one who had woken that morning. Not wiser, necessarily. Not stronger. Just ... changed, like how extreme heat changes the molecular structure of glass, making it something new that can never return to what it was before. I knew I needed to leave. There was no question about that. I couldn't stay in this valley, couldn't continue my research, couldn't risk seeing him again. But I also couldn't just flee immediately. I had 4 months of documentation, specimens that needed proper preservation, notes that needed to be organized. The monastery was depending on me to return with usable research, and I wouldn't let my personal disaster compromise the scientific value of the work. So I stayed, but I became a ghost in my own life. I worked from dawn until dusk, or what passed for those things in a sunless valley. I avoided the castle completely, taking different paths to my research sites, working in areas I knew were far from his usual territory. Once, I saw him in the distance, a dark figure on a cliff edge, and I turned and walked the other way without a second's hesitation. He didn't come looking for me. Of course he didn't. Why would he? I was an echo, a temporary fixture, something to notice but not listen to. My absence probably didn't register any more significantly than my presence had. I finished my work in 3 weeks, a process that should have taken twice that long. Desperation is an excellent motivator, I learned. Fear of encountering him drove me to an efficiency I'd never achieved before. Every sample was perfectly preserved, every note was meticulously recorded, Every sketch was completed to archival standards. It was the best work I'd ever done, fueled entirely by the need to escape. On my last night in the valley, I did something I probably shouldn't have. I walked to the edge of the castle grounds, not close enough to be seen, but close enough to see. The amber lights were on in the library, the room where we'd spent so many evenings in conversation that had meant everything to me and nothing to him. I wondered if he was in there now, sitting in his usual chair, reading one of his ancient texts, completely undisturbed by my imminent departure. I wondered if he'd even noticed I'd stopped visiting. I wondered if, in a few years, when another researcher came to study the valley, he'd treat them with the same polite courtesy, allow them the same privileges, create the same space for them to build their own fictional narratives. The eclipse was coming. I could feel it in the air, that particular quality that precedes celestial events. Both moons would align perfectly, blocking out each other's light, plunging the valley into a darkness deeper than its usual twilight. The locals had been preparing for weeks, stocking extra candles, making sure their homes were secure. They treated eclipses like storms, natural disasters to be weathered rather than witnessed. I decided to stay for it. One last night in the valley, one last observation. Scientific justification for what was really just an inability to leave without some kind of ending. Some moment that felt like closure. The eclipse began an hour before midnight. Selith, the pale moon, started to slide in front of Morith, the blue one. The silver light dimmed first, then the blue. The valley falling into shadows that were so complete, I had to light my lantern just to see my own hands. And in that darkness, I felt something shift, not externally but inside me, like a cord that had been pulled taut for months suddenly going slack. The tension I'd been carrying, the hope and pain and confusion and heartbreak, all of it seemed to loosen its grip. In absolute darkness, I couldn't see the castle. Couldn't see the research station. Couldn't see the paths I'd walked, or the gardens I'd tended, or any of the physical markers of my time here. There was only the dark, and me, and the sound of my own breathing. And for the first time since that terrible night of overheard conversations, I felt something other than pain. Not happiness, not relief, but something quieter. Recognition, maybe. The understanding that I'd survived. That I was still here, still breathing, still capable of witnessing beauty even in the midst of hurt. The eclipse reached totality, and the darkness was so complete it felt like being erased from existence. I stood there in it, letting it wash over me, letting it take away the girl who'd walked hopefully to a castle with a dying lily in her hands. When the moons began to separate again, when the first sliver of light returned to the valley, I was different. Not healed, not over it, but changed in a way that felt permanent. The shadows hadn't destroyed me. They'd just shown me what I was without the light I'd been so desperate to find in someone else's eyes. I packed my things that night by the returning moonlight. Every sample, every journal, every tool. I left nothing behind, no trace that I'd been there beyond my footprints, which the wind and time would erase soon enough. At dawn, or what passed for it, I started the long walk out of the valley. I didn't look back at the castle. I didn't need to. I'd already said goodbye to what I'd thought was there, and that version had been dead long before I left. The climb up through the mountain passes was brutal. My packs were heavy, and I was exhausted from weeks of frantic work and emotional devastation. But with every step away from Nocthaven, I felt lighter. Not happier, not yet, but lighter. Like I was emerging from underwater, each breath coming a little easier than the last. When I finally reached the top of the highest pass and looked back, I could barely see the valley anymore. It was just a dark spot between the mountains. A place that might not exist at all if you didn't know to look for it. And I realized something then, standing there on the boundary between the light world and the shadowed one. Theron had been right about one thing. I was temporary. My time in his valley, in his castle, in his awareness, had been brief and ultimately insignificant to the larger patterns of his existence. But here's what he got wrong. What beings who measure time in centuries often miss. Temporary doesn't mean meaningless. Brief doesn't equal insignificant. The moonshade lily blooms for one night every 100 years, and then it dies. That doesn't make its bloom any less extraordinary. That doesn't make the people who witness it any less changed by the experience. I had been a small bird, an echo, a temporary fixture, but I had been there. I had existed in that space, had felt those feelings, had reached for connection with everything I had. That it wasn't returned, that it wasn't even noticed, didn't erase the fact that it had been real for me. And more than that, I had survived its ending. The Monastery of Sacred Roots welcomed me back with little fanfare. Brother Aldrich reviewed my research with growing excitement, declaring it some of the most comprehensive botanical documentation the order had seen in decades. My pressed specimens were added to the archives, my notes were copied and distributed to other scholars. And my name was indeed recorded in the botanical records, just as I'd once hoped it would be. But I found I didn't care about that as much as I'd thought I would. The recognition felt hollow, like applause for a performance I didn't remember giving. I threw myself into new work, new research projects that kept me busy and distracted. I took on students, passing along the techniques I'd learned in Noctaven and carefully avoiding any stories about the vampire lord who lived there. When people asked about my time in the valley, I gave them the scientific highlights and nothing more. Years passed, 5 of them, each one adding layers of distance between me and that young woman who'd walked into darkness with hope in her heart. I moved through my life, accomplished and respected in my field, and I told myself I was fine, that I'd moved on, that it was all ancient history, that I barely even thought about it anymore. That was mostly true, except for the nights when I'd wake from dreams I couldn't quite remember, my heart racing, the phantom weight of someone's gaze on my skin. Except for the moments when I'd catch the scent of night-blooming flowers and feel my chest constrict with a longing I had no right to still carry. Except for the times when I'd find myself touching my throat, remembering the way his eyes had lingered there once, and wondering what might have been if I'd been something other than human, something other than temporary. But I got good at pushing those moments aside, good at functioning, at moving forward, at building a life that looked full from the outside, even if it sometimes felt hollow at the center. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in early spring, delivered by a courier who looked exhausted, like he'd traveled a very long distance. The envelope was made of heavy paper, sealed with black wax pressed with a symbol I recognized immediately, a crescent moon and a lily, the crest of House Noctaven. My hands shook as I opened it. I told myself it was just surprise, just the shock of unexpected contact. But part of me knew better. Part of me had been waiting for this, though I'd never admitted it, even to myself. The letter was not from Theron. It was from someone named Sylvain, who identified herself as the Castellan of Noctaven. She wrote in a formal, almost archaic style, explaining that she was reaching out on a matter of some urgency. Lord Theron had fallen into what she called a shadow sleep, a vampiric condition that occurred when one of their kind suffered a severe spiritual or emotional trauma. He'd been in this state for several months, unresponsive to all attempts to wake him, slowly fading in a way that suggested he might not survive much longer. She explained that they'd tried everything their kind knew to try rituals, blood offerings, consultations with ancient texts. Nothing had worked. In her research through his personal effects, searching for some clue as to what might have triggered this condition, She'd found something unexpected. My journals. Not the scientific ones I'd brought back to the monastery. Personal ones. The ones I'd thought I'd lost or left behind in my hasty departure. Journals filled with my private thoughts, my observations, my feelings about the valley, and about him. She'd found them in his private chambers, well worn, with passages underlined and margin notes in his precise handwriting, notes that suggested he'd read them many times, that he'd been analyzing my words with the same intensity he'd once applied to ancient texts. And in one of the journals, tucked between the pages like a pressed flower, she'd found something else. The stem of the moonshade lily carefully preserved, labeled in his handwriting with the date and location where he'd found it, and a single word, regalo, gift. Sylvain wrote that she didn't understand the full context, but it seemed clear that his condition was somehow connected to me, to my time in the valley, to something that had remained unresolved between us. She was asking, no, begging me to return. Not for his sake, she wrote, though she hoped I might feel some compassion for him, but because I might be the only one who could provide the closure or resolution or whatever it was that his spirit needed to either wake or let go. The letter concluded with a line that would haunt me for weeks. Whatever passed between you, whether bitter or sweet, it seems to have mattered far more than he allowed anyone to know. Perhaps more than he allowed himself to know. I read the letter 7 times, and with each reading I felt different emotions crash over me in waves. Anger. How dare he suffer now, after what he'd said, after how he'd dismissed me? Satisfaction. A petty, ugly feeling that at least I'd mattered enough to leave a mark, even if it was a wound. Confusion. How could any of this be true when I'd heard his words so clearly that night? Here, what if I went back and he confirmed everything I'd overheard, destroying me all over again? And underneath it all, deeper than I wanted to acknowledge, there was something else. Concern. The traitorous, persistent concern for someone who had once mattered to me. Regardless of whether I'd mattered to him, I didn't decide to go. Not consciously, but I found myself making arrangements anyway, requesting a leave of absence from the monastery, packing supplies, hiring a guide for the mountain passes. Brother Aldrich asked me if I was sure, his old eyes seeing more than I wanted to reveal, and I told him I needed to see this through, that there was unfinished research, loose ends to tie up. We both knew I was lying. The journey back to Noctaven took the same 2 weeks as before, but it felt longer. Every mile closer to the valley filled me with increasing dread and anticipation in equal measure. I kept imagining what I'd find. Would he be lying in some state of suspended death, pale and still? Would he wake when he saw me, or would my presence make no difference at all? And what would I say to him if he did wake? What words existed for this situation? When I finally descended into the valley, the wave of memory that hit me was almost physical. The cold air, the mineral taste, the oppressive silence. It was exactly as I remembered, unchanged by the 5 years that had passed. For a place that supposedly measured time in centuries, I suppose 5 years was nothing. A blink, a breath. The castle gates stood open and Sylvain was waiting for me. She was tall, elegant, with the kind of timeless beauty that all vampires seem to possess. Her hair was white blonde, her eyes a pale green, and when she looked at me, I saw relief and hope in equal measure. She thanked me for coming, her voice carrying genuine gratitude. She told me that Lord Theron's condition had worsened in the weeks since she'd sent the letter, that he now barely seemed to breathe, that the shadow sleep was deepening into something that looked more like true death. Time was running out, if it hadn't run out already. She led me through the familiar corridors, and every step brought back memories I'd worked so hard to bury. The library where we'd talked for hours, the gallery where I'd left pressed flowers, the gardens where he'd taught me about midnight cultivation techniques. It all looked the same, preserved perfectly, as if waiting for me to return and continue the story I'd abandoned. We stopped at a door I'd never been through before, in a wing of the castle I'd never explored. His private chambers, Sylvain explained. She told me she'd leave me alone with him, that privacy seemed appropriate for whatever needed to happen. Then she handed me something, my journals, the ones he'd kept, and she told me I should read his notes before I went in. That context might help me understand. I waited until she'd left before I opened the first journal. It was the one I'd kept during my second month in the valley, filled with botanical observations and, increasingly, personal reflections. His notes in the margins were extensive, written in a hand so small I had to squint to read them. Next to a passage where I'd written about feeling isolated despite being surrounded by beauty, he'd noted, "The burden of being exceptional. She doesn't see it yet, but she's brilliant. Will she realize it before she leaves? Will she believe me if I tell her?" Next to a page where I'd described watching him from across the courtyard, wondering what he was thinking, he'd written, "She watches me the way I watch her. Does she know? Would it change anything if she did?" On a page where I'd confessed to my journal that I'd never felt more alive than in those evening conversations, he'd written simply, "Neither have I. Not in 200 years. What does that mean? I turned pages, finding more notes, each one a window into thoughts he'd never expressed aloud. Observations about my laugh, how it had startled him the first time he heard it, how the castle had been silent of genuine laughter for longer than he could remember. Comments about my habit of gesturing when I explained plant biology, how he'd found it charming, how he'd started anticipating those moments. A long note about the night I'd brought him sketches of bioluminescent moss, where he'd written about the trust implied in sharing one's work, the vulnerability of creating something and offering it to another's judgment. And then, near the end of that journal, on a page where I'd written about the difficulty of reading him, of never knowing what he was thinking, he'd written, "Good. If she knew, if she understood what she's become to me, the power she'd hold would terrify us both. Better, she thinks me indifferent, safer for her, kinder." I sat down right there in the hallway, my legs suddenly unable to support me. I opened the second journal, the one from my third month, and found more of the same. Page after page of his private thoughts, contradicting every assumption I'd made about his indifference. On a page where I'd wondered if he looked forward to our conversations or merely tolerated them, he'd written, "Her arrival has become the marker by which I measure days. Before she comes, after she leaves. And the hours between when I can hear her heartbeat somewhere in the castle, that persistent reminder of life. That persistent reminder of life." The heartbeat, he'd said, was too loud, too noisy. I'd thought he meant it was annoying. But here, in his private notes, the truth was different. He'd been aware of my heartbeat because he'd been listening for it, tracking it, finding comfort in the proof of my presence. I found the page where I'd written about feeling like I was intruding, like maybe I should visit less frequently, give him space. His note beside it was longer than most. "She's pulling back. I can feel it. Did I make her uncomfortable? Was I too intense in our last conversation? I should encourage her to come more often, make her feel welcome. But how do I do that without revealing too much? How do I say you've become essential to someone whose life is measured in decades, not centuries? She'll leave eventually. They all do. Better not to form attachments that will hurt us both." The final journal was from my fourth month, the last weeks before everything fell apart. The notes here were more frequent, more urgent. Beside passages where I described my growing feelings, trying to decode his behavior, he'd written things that made my heart ache. "She's looking at me differently now. I should discourage it. I should create distance, but gods, I don't want to. Is it selfish to enjoy being seen this way? To pretend, just for these brief weeks, that this could be something more than what it is?" And then, Toward the end, on a page I'd written just days before that terrible night, where I'd confessed to my journal that I was falling in love with him, that I knew it was foolish, but I couldn't help it. His note was a single sentence, underlined 3 times. She can't mean this. She can't. Can she? My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the journals. I understood now, or thought I did. He'd been protecting himself, or protecting me, or protecting both of us. He'd been afraid of vulnerability, of the temporary nature of human life, of forming a connection that would inevitably end in loss. So he'd maintained distance, careful control, never letting me see how much my presence actually affected him. But that didn't explain what I'd overheard. Those words had been cruel, dismissive, exactly what they'd sounded like. Unless... I stood up, journals clutched to my chest, and I pushed open the door to his chambers. The room was large but surprisingly simple. No ostentatious displays of wealth, just well-made furniture, bookshelves filled with volumes that looked ancient, and windows overlooking the valley. And in the center, a large bed where he lay, perfectly still. I'd expected him to look like a corpse, cold and distant even in this vulnerable state. But he didn't. He looked like he was sleeping, like he might wake any moment. His hair was the same dark fall across the pillow, his features unmarked by time or suffering. But there was something wrong about his stillness. Too complete, too absolute. Even in sleep, living things moves, minor adjustments. He was like carved stone, beautiful and lifeless. I approached slowly, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. When I reached the bedside, I found myself doing something I'd never done in all our time together. I touched him, just my fingertips against his hand, which lay on top of the coverlet. His skin was cold, but then it had always been cold. Vampires didn't generate heat the way humans did. I pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, journals in my lap, and I did the only thing I could think to do. I talked to him. I told him about reading his notes, about the confusion and pain and strange relief they'd brought. I explained what I'd overheard that night, the words that had driven me away, the interpretation I'd built from them. I described the 5 years since, the work I'd done, the person I'd tried to become. And then, because I'd spent 5 years not saying what I needed to say, I told him the truth. I told him that I had loved him simply and completely, in the way that young people love before they learn all the reasons to be careful. I told him that his words had devastated me, but that the devastation had also taught me things about my own strength, my capacity to survive heartbreak. I told him that I'd been angry at him for years, furious at the dismissiveness, the cruelty, the way he'd made me feel insignificant. But I also told him that reading his notes had complicated that anger, had made me wonder if I'd misunderstood everything. Had he been cruel to push me away? Had he been trying to save me from something, from himself, from the inevitable pain of a relationship that couldn't last? Or had I simply overheard a moment of frustration, taken out of context, a private conversation that was never meant for my ears? I told him I didn't know, that I might never know, but that I'd come back anyway, because Sylvain's letter had made one thing clear: whatever had happened between us, it had mattered. To me, yes, but also to him, in ways he'd never let me see. I talked until my voice went hoarse, until the moons had crossed the sky and were beginning to set. And through it all, he remained still, unchanged, locked in whatever darkness held him. Finally, exhausted and emotionally drained, I asked him the only question that mattered. Was it real? Any of it? Did I imagine the connection, or were you feeling it too and just couldn't let yourself acknowledge it? Silence. Of course, silence. Whatever answers existed, they were locked inside him, inaccessible to anyone, including himself. I stood to leave, accepting that this journey had been for nothing, that some questions don't get answered, when I noticed something. On the table beside his bed, there was a small glass case, the kind used to preserve delicate specimens. Inside was the stem of the moonshade lily, the one Sylvain had mentioned in her letter. I picked it up carefully, holding it to the moonlight. He'd preserved it perfectly, using techniques I recognized from my own training. The stem still held the faintest ghost of luminescence, barely visible but present. And attached to the case was a small label in his handwriting. Moonshade lily stem, found in the hallway outside the Great Hall, night of the lunar alignment. Given freely and rejected by cowardice. A reminder of the cost of fear. Given freely. He'd known I was there that night. He'd found the dropped lily, had understood what it meant, what I'd intended. And he'd kept it, preserved it, labeled it as a reminder of his own failure, which meant ... I turned back to the bed, realization crashing over me. You knew I was there. You knew I heard you. Still no response, but I continued anyway, pieces falling into place. You pushed me away deliberately. You said those things knowing I was listening, wanting me to hear them. Why? To protect me? To make sure I'd leave? I thought about those margin notes, about his fear of attachment, about the way he'd written about wanting to create distance, and I understood, with a clarity that felt like breaking, he'd driven me away because he'd been falling too, and he couldn't handle it. Couldn't handle the vulnerability, the inevitable loss, the brief, bright flame of human life against his centuries of existence. So he'd killed it before it could hurt him worse. Had said the cruelest possible things in the cruelest possible way, ensuring I'd leave and stay gone. And then he'd lived with that choice for 5 years until the weight of it had finally pulled him under. You idiot, I whispered, and for the first time since arriving, I felt tears on my face. You stupid, cowardly, idiotic creature. You could have just talked to me. You could have explained. We could have figured it out together, or at least ended it honestly. But instead, you chose this cruelty disguised as dismissal, pain dressed up as indifference. And now you're here, trapped in whatever darkness you've built for yourself, and I can't even yell at you properly. I sat back down, wiping my face with my sleeve, and I made a decision. Fine. You want to stay in there, in your shadow sleep or whatever this is? Fine. But you're going to hear some things first. And you don't get to hide or deflect or protect yourself with careful distance. You're going to listen to every word. I spent the next hour telling him everything. Every hurt, every hope, every moment of the past 5 years when I'd thought about him and wished I didn't. I told him about the nights I'd woken from dreams of his voice, about the times I'd caught myself looking for him in crowds, knowing he wouldn't be there. I told him about the anger I'd carried and the grief underneath it and the slow, painful process of trying to move forward. But I also told him about the good things. The research I'd completed using techniques he'd taught me. The students I'd mentored, passing on knowledge I'd gained in his library. The strength I'd discovered in myself, forged in the fire of that heartbreak. I told him that while I wished it had happened differently, I couldn't regret entirely the person I'd become in the aftermath. And finally, as the sky began to lighten toward dawn, I told him the hardest truth of all. I forgive you. I don't know if you deserve it. I don't even know if you want it. But I forgive you anyway, because I'm tired of carrying this weight, and because I understand now what fear can make us do. You were scared, and you lashed out, and you hurt me deeply. But you've been hurting too, clearly. And I can't hold on to this anger knowing that it's destroying us both. I stood one final time, preparing to leave, to return to my life and let him remain in his darkness. But before I could move, I felt it, the slightest shift in the air, a change so subtle I almost missed it. His hand, the one I'd touched earlier, moved. Just a fraction, just the smallest curl of fingers, but it was movement. It was response. I grabbed his hand, holding it tight, and I called his name. Theron. Theron, if you can hear me, if any part of you is still in there, you need to wake up. You need to come back. Another small movement, his head turning slightly toward my voice. And then, so quietly, I almost missed it. A whisper. Ilara. My name. He'd said my name. 5 years since I'd heard his voice, and hearing it now, rough with disuse but unmistakably his, broke something open inside me. I'm here, I said, squeezing his hand. I'm right here. Come back, please. His eyes opened slowly, those pale silver eyes that I'd seen in my dreams so many times. They were unfocused at first, confused, like someone waking from a very long sleep. But then they found me, locked onto my face, and I watched awareness flood back into them. You came, he said, his voice barely audible. Not a question, a statement of wonder. Sylvain wrote to me. She said you were... I couldn't finish the sentence. Couldn't put into words how close he'd come to whatever constituted death for his kind. He tried to sit up, failed, and I helped him, arranging pillows behind him. For someone who'd always been so composed, so perfectly in control, seeing him this weak was jarring. His hand remained in mine, gripped tight like he was afraid I'd disappear. I heard you, he said after a moment. Everything you said. I couldn't respond, couldn't move, but I heard every word, which meant he knew. About the forgiveness, about the pain, about all of it. The vulnerability of that realization made me want to pull away, to protect myself, but I forced myself to stay still, to hold his gaze. The things I said that night, he continued, his voice growing stronger. The conversation you overheard. I knew you were there. I could hear your heartbeat in the hallway, could sense your presence. And I said those things anyway. I know, I said quietly. I figured that out. The lily stem, your notes, it all pointed to that. You pushed me away deliberately. He nodded. And there was such raw pain in his expression that I felt my anger waver despite wanting to hold on to it. I was terrified, he admitted. You were becoming ... You'd become everything. The first thought when I woke, the last before I slept. I'd catch myself listening for your heartbeat throughout the day, finding excuses to be where you might walk past. I was falling in love with you and I couldn't let it continue. Hearing him say it, finally saying it out loud, made my breath catch. Why not? Because you're human, he said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Because even if you felt the same, even if we tried, I'd have maybe 50 or 60 years with you if I was lucky. And then I'd have centuries of remembering, of missing you, of existing in a world where you didn't. I've lost people before, Ilara, friends, companions, those I cared for. It never gets easier. And the thought of losing you, of watching you age and fade while I remained unchanged, single, quotes. He closed his eyes. I couldn't do it, so I tried to kill it before it fully took root. By making me hate you. Yes, better a clean break, I thought. Better to drive you away completely than to have you leave slowly, naturally, when your research concluded. I thought if I made you hate me, it would be easier. For you and for me. I pulled my hand from his, and I saw fear flash across his face. But I didn't leave. I just needed the physical distance to think clearly. Do you understand how much that hurt? How completely those words destroyed what I'd built in my head? I do now, he said quietly. When you left, when I realized you were really gone, I told myself it was for the best, that I'd done the right thing, the necessary thing, but then I found your journals. You'd left them in the station, and I... single quotes, he paused, something like shame crossing his features. I shouldn't have kept them, shouldn't have read them, but I did. Over and over, and with each reading, I understood more of what I'd destroyed. Not just your feelings for me, but your trust, your confidence, your belief that you mattered. That was the worst part, I admitted. Not the rejection, but the way you made me feel insignificant. Like I was just background noise, easily ignored and quickly forgotten. You were never that, he said with such intensity it startled me. Never. Not for one moment. You were ... single quotes he searched for words. Sunlight in a dark place. Life in stagnation. You made me feel things I'd thought I'd outgrown centuries ago. And that terrified me more than anything had in a very long time. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of these admissions settling between us. Finally, I asked the question that mattered. If you could go back, would you do it differently? He considered this, and I appreciated that he didn't immediately say yes, that he actually thought about it. I don't know, he finally said. The outcome for me is the same regardless. At some point, I would have lost you, either to your leaving, or to time, or to any of the 1,000 natural ends that humans face and vampires don't. The pain was inevitable. I just tried to control when and how it came. That's not love, I said quietly. That's management. That's refusing to feel something because you're afraid of the cost. I know. He looked at me with those ancient eyes, and for the first time, I saw the true depth of his existence. The centuries of loss, of watching everyone he'd ever cared for disappear, of being the constant in a world of variables. You're right. But I also know that after 5 years of your absence, of living with what I'd done and what I'd lost, it nearly destroyed me anyway. So my attempt to avoid pain just delayed it and made it worse. I've spent every day, since you left, regretting what I said, how I said it. The look on your face that I never saw but could perfectly imagine. You couldn't have known I was listening if you didn't see me. I knew, he said simply. I knew the moment you arrived outside the hall. I heard your heartbeat, caught your scent excitement and hope and nervousness all mixed together. And I knew you'd brought me something, planned something, that you were about to make yourself vulnerable in a way you hadn't before. So I made sure you'd hear me say the cruelest possible things. I told myself I was being kind in the long run, that sometimes you have to hurt someone to protect them from greater hurt later. That's a terrible philosophy. Yes, he agreed. It is, and it nearly killed us both. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I saw the truth of it written in every line of his face. He'd suffered too. Maybe not as immediately as I had, maybe not in the same way, but he'd paid a price for his choice. And he was paying it still, would likely continue paying it for however many centuries he had left. So what now? I asked. I forgave you, which apparently helped break whatever curse you'd trapped yourself in. But that doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't change the fundamental problem. I'm human, you're not. And any relationship between us has a built-in expiration date. I know, he said softly, and I'm not asking you to try again. I'm not asking for anything, really. You came when Sylvain asked. You spoke truths I needed to hear. You pulled me back from a darkness I'd built for myself. That's already more than I had any right to expect. He was giving me an out. The mature, reasonable choice. We could both walk away from this with closure, with understanding, with forgiveness granted and accepted. We could return to our separate lives, carrying this moment as a bittersweet memory, but nothing more. It would be the smart thing to do. The safe thing. What if I don't want to walk away? I heard myself say, the words surprising me even as I spoke them. What if I want to try despite the inevitable end, despite the pain waiting down the road? His eyes widened, genuine shock breaking through his usual control. Alara, you can't mean that. After everything I did, everything you've been through, I spent 5 years building a life without you. I interrupted. A good life, a meaningful one. I have work I'm proud of, students who depend on me, research that matters. I'm not that young, naive girl who showed up in your valley thinking she understood anything about anything. I know you're not. So understand this. I'm not offering to try again because I'm clinging to some fantasy or because I haven't moved on. I'm offering because I have moved on, past the hurt and anger to something clearer. And from this clearer place, I can see that what we had, or what we might have had, was real. Flawed and complicated and probably doomed to hurt eventually, but real. And it seems like a shame to walk away from something real just because it's also difficult. He stared at me like I'd started speaking a language he didn't understand. You're saying you'd want to try a relationship, knowing it would end badly? All relationships end, I pointed out. Death, distance, change, everything ends eventually. The question is whether the time we have is worth the pain of losing it, and I think it might be. If we're honest this time, if we go into it with eyes open, acknowledging the difficulties instead of running from them. I hurt you, he said, like I might have forgotten. Yes, you did. And that's going to take time to fully work through, to fully trust you again. This wouldn't be easy, Theron. We'd have to figure out how to bridge the gap between your centuries and my decades. We'd have to deal with the fact that I'll age and change while you stay the same. We'd have to accept that our ending is written in biology and time. That one day I'll be gone and you'll still be here. Those are considerable obstacles. They are, I agreed. But here's what I learned in your absence. Trying to avoid pain by avoiding connection doesn't actually work. You still feel the loss, the absence, the what's might have been. It just eats at you differently, more slowly maybe, but just as thoroughly. So we can be apart and spend decades wondering what we missed. Or we can be together and build something beautiful, knowing it's temporary. Honestly, I'm not sure which option is braver. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with something that looked almost like tears, though I've never heard of vampires crying. I don't deserve this. Don't deserve you, or your forgiveness, or this chance. Probably not, I said with a small smile. But we rarely get what we deserve in this life. Sometimes we get lucky instead. The question is what we do with that luck when it arrives. He reached for my hand again, and this time I let him take it, his cold fingers interlacing with my warm ones. The contrast had always been there, the fundamental difference between us made physical. But now, instead of seeing it as a sign of incompatibility, I saw it as a metaphor. Hot and cold, temporary and eternal, human and vampire. Maybe the point wasn't to erase the differences, but to learn to exist within them. If we do this, he said carefully, I need you to understand something. I will do everything in my power to make every day we have good. But when the end comes, when time finally takes you from me, I will grieve. Deeply, thoroughly, probably for longer than you can imagine. And I'll have to live with that grief for centuries. I'm choosing to do that, but I need you to know what you'll be leaving behind. I know, I said quietly. And I'm sorry for that, but I also think that's the price of loving someone who's temporary. You carry them with you after they're gone. You make them immortal in the only way that matters, in memory and impact, in the way they changed you. I won't live for centuries, but I'll live in you for that long. There's something beautiful in that, don't you think? He pulled me closer, careful, despite his obvious desire to hold on tight, and I let myself settle against his chest. I could hear his heartbeat, slow and steady, so much slower than my own racing one. That persistent reminder of life he'd called mine. And now I could hear his in return, a different rhythm but harmony nonetheless. I'm still afraid, he admitted quietly. Of losing you, of not being enough, of all of it. Good, I said. Fear means it matters. Means you're taking a real risk, not just managing variables. We'll both be afraid sometimes, and we'll both mess up. And it'll probably be complicated and messy, and nothing like the stories say it should be. That sounds terrible. It sounds human, I corrected, which is what love is ultimately. Beautifully, painfully, perfectly human. Even when one of you isn't. We stayed like that as the sun or what passed for it in Knocked Haven rose higher in the sky. Not talking, just existing together, letting the reality of this tentative new beginning settle around us. There would be conversations to come, boundaries to establish, fears to work through. But for now, this was enough. Two beings who'd hurt each other learning to try again, choosing connection despite its costs. Later, when Sylvain knocked softly and entered with tea and what I suspected was blood for Theron, she stopped short at the sight of us. A smile crossed her face, genuine relief mixed with satisfaction. "Lord Theron, you're awake." I'm so relieved. Thank you for writing to Alara," he said, his voice still rough but stronger than before. "It was the right call. I had hoped, ... single quotes. She glanced between us, clearly seeing how I was still tucked against his side. "Should I prepare a room for Miss Alara?" "If she's willing to stay," Theron said, looking at me with a question in his eyes. I thought about my life back at the monastery, my responsibilities, my carefully built routine. I thought about the complications that staying would create, the difficulties that lay ahead. And then I thought about the alternative, walking away again, returning to safety, spending the rest of my life wondering what if. For a while, I said, "I'll need to send word to the monastery, let them know I'll be extending my research trip. And eventually I'll need to return, at least temporarily, to settle some matters. But yes, I'll stay." "We have a lot to figure out," Sylvain nodded, that knowing smile still on her face. "I'll have a room prepared immediately. And perhaps, when you're both ready, we should discuss how to make the castle more accommodating for a human resident. It's been quite some time since we've had someone who needs things like regular meals and, well, sunlight substitutes." "I don't need sunlight," I said wryly. "I spent 4 months here before without it." "Yes, but that was for research," she pointed out. "This is for living. There's a difference." She was right, of course. Everything was different now. The same valley, the same castle, even the same 2 people, but all of it transformed by honesty, by vulnerability, by the choice to try despite knowing how it would end. After Sylvain left, I finally pulled away from Theron, though I kept hold of his hand. "You need to rest more. You nearly died, or whatever the equivalent is for your kind. Don't think that just because you're awake now, everything is fixed. You need time to recover. Will you be here when I wake?" he asked, and there was something almost childlike in the question, a vulnerability I'd never heard from him before. "Yes," I promised. "I'm not going anywhere. Not today, at least. We have time now, Theron. Time to do this properly, to build something real instead of something imagined." He nodded, settling back against the pillows, his eyes already starting to close. "Alara?" "Yes." "I love you. I should have said it 5 years ago. I should have said it instead of all those cruel things, but I'm saying it now. I love you." The words hung in the air, simple and profound, and 5 years too late, and also somehow exactly on time. I squeezed his hand, feeling the weight of them, the gift of them. "I love you too," I said quietly. "Even though you're an idiot, even though this is probably going to be complicated and difficult and occasionally painful. I love you." A small smile touched his lips, the first real smile I'd ever seen from him. "That's more than I deserve." "It is," I agreed. "But we already established we don't always get what we deserve. Sometimes we get better. Sometimes we get a second chance." He drifted off to sleep then, his hand still in mine, and I sat there watching him. Not with the desperate longing of before, but with something clearer, more grounded. Love mixed with realism, hope tempered by understanding, connection that acknowledged its own fragility. The darkness hadn't destroyed me after all. It had tested me, shaped me, and ultimately taught me that I was stronger than I'd known. And now, returned to this place where I'd once been broken, I found I wasn't the same person. I'd survived the leaving, and that survival had given me the strength to try staying. Not forever. Nothing is forever. Not really. But for now, for whatever time we had, I would stay. I would love this impossible creature who'd hurt me and saved me and nearly destroyed himself over me. I would build something in this valley of eternal twilight, something that would bloom bright and brief like the moonshade lily, beautiful precisely because it was temporary. The moons were setting now, Selith and Morath making their slow arc toward the horizon. In a few hours they'd rise again, as they always did, unchanging and eternal. But I would change. Day by day, year by year, I would age and grow and eventually fade, leaving Theron to his centuries of memory. And strangely, I found I was okay with that. Not happy about it, not eager for that ending, but accepting of it. Because the alternative, never loving, never risking, that was its own kind of death. A slower one maybe, but just as final. I had been born into light, but I'd learned to live in darkness. And now I understood that darkness and light weren't opposites, weren't enemies. They were just different ways of seeing, different ways of being. And somewhere between them, in that liminal space where shadow met silver moonlight, there was room for love. Complicated, imperfect, doomed love that was still worth having. The moonshade lily I'd brought him all those years ago had died within hours of being cut. But the memory of it had lived on, preserved in glass and labeled in careful handwriting, a reminder of what we'd lost. Now we had a chance to cultivate something new, to tend it carefully while it lived, and to honor its memory when it was gone. I looked around the room at this space that might become familiar to me over time, and I made a decision. Tomorrow I would start making plans, practical ones about how this would work. Logistical considerations about dividing time between the valley and the monastery. Conversations about boundaries and expectations and all the mundane details that relationships require. Tomorrow I would be sensible and careful and realistic. But tonight, I would simply sit here, holding the hand of someone I loved, someone who loved me back, and I would let that be enough. The complications would still be there tomorrow. The inevitable ending would still be waiting somewhere down the line. But right now, in this moment, we were both here, both awake, both choosing each other, despite every reasonable argument against it, and that felt like its own kind of magic. Hours passed. The room grew darker as the moons completed their descent. I should have been exhausted. I'd traveled for 2 weeks, confronted 5 years of pain, and poured out my heart to someone who might not have been able to hear me. But I felt strangely energized, like I'd been carrying a weight for so long that its absence made me feel lighter than air. Eventually, Sylvain returned, knocking softly before entering. She took in the scene, sleeping peacefully for the first time in months, me still sitting beside him, our hands still linked, and her expression softened. She told me my room was ready, that there was food waiting, that I should rest and recover from my journey. But she said it gently, without insistence, like she understood that I might not be ready to leave yet. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for writing to me. For taking that risk. It couldn't have been easy reaching out to someone he'd driven away." She settled into a chair across from the bed, her movements graceful and silent. She explained that she'd watched him deteriorating for months, withdrawing further into himself, spending hours reading those journals, and she'd known something had to be done. She told me that in all her years serving House Nochthaven, and it had been many years, she'd never seen him like this. She'd seen him angry, seen him tired, seen him dealing with the weight of centuries, but she'd never seen him break. Not until I left. "He tried to hide it at first," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maintained his usual routine, handled estate business, received visitors. But I noticed small things. The way he'd pause in doorways like he was listening for something that wasn't there. How he'd end up in the library at odd hours, sitting in the same chair where you'd apparently spent evenings together. The way he started avoiding the gardens because, as I later learned, you'd worked there frequently. I absorbed this, imagining him in those months after I'd left. Had he expected me to come back? Had he hoped I would, even after what he'd said? Or had he resigned himself to the loss, telling himself it was for the best, even as it hollowed him out from the inside? Sylvain continued, telling me about how the shadow sleep had come on gradually. First, he'd started sleeping longer, unusual for vampires who typically needed very little rest. Then he'd begun missing appointments, forgetting obligations, withdrawing from responsibilities he'd maintained for decades. And finally, about 4 months ago, he'd simply not woken one evening. Just lay there, perfectly still, barely breathing, unreachable by any method they tried. She explained that she'd searched his chambers looking for clues, some indication of what might have triggered this. That's when she'd found the journals, hidden in a locked drawer like treasures. And the lily stem, preserved with a care that suggested it was precious beyond measure. She'd read enough to understand that there had been something between us, something that had ended badly, and she'd made the decision to find me. "I wasn't certain you'd come," she admitted. "After reading some of your entries, understanding how much he'd hurt you, I thought you might refuse. But I had to try. For his sake, yes, but also because it seemed clear that this was unfinished for you as well, that you both deserved a chance to resolve it, one way or another. I almost didn't come," I confessed. "I spent 2 weeks convincing myself this was a terrible idea, that I was setting myself up for more pain. But something in your letter, ... the way you described him keeping my journals, the preserved lily ... I needed to know. Needed to understand if I'd been wrong about everything. And now? Now I know I was partially wrong and partially right. Wrong about his feelings, they were real, even if he wouldn't acknowledge them. But right about the hurt, the dismissal, the cruelty. Both things were true at once, which is somehow worse and better than if it had been purely one or the other." We talked for a while longer, about practical matters mostly. She told me about the valley's current state, which researchers had come and gone in my absence, how the local human population was doing. She explained that the castle had extensive resources if I wanted to continue botanical work, that Lord Theron had actually expanded the library's natural sciences section over the past few years, acquiring rare texts on botany and biological studies. "He never said why," she told me with a knowing look, "but I suspect he was preparing, hoping that someday you might return and want to use them." The thought of him collecting books for me, building a library within his library, maintaining hope even after everything, it made my chest ache in a way that wasn't entirely painful. Finally, I agreed to let her show me to my room. I extracted my hand from Theron's carefully, trying not to wake him, but his fingers tightened briefly before releasing. Even in sleep, some part of him was aware, reluctant to let go. The room she'd prepared for me was beautiful, smaller than his chambers, but still spacious by monastery standards. With large windows overlooking the valley, a comfortable bed, a desk perfect for writing, and shelves that were already stocked with botanical reference materials. Someone had even brought in several specimens of valley flora, arranged in vases throughout the space. "I took the liberty of assuming you'd want to work during your stay," Sylvain said. "These can be removed if you prefer." "No, they're perfect. Thank you." She left me then with instructions to ring if I needed anything, and suddenly, I was alone for the first time in hours. The adrenaline that had been sustaining me began to fade, and exhaustion crashed over me like a wave. I should have eaten something, should have washed up properly, changed clothes, done all the practical things one does after a long journey. But instead, I simply collapsed onto the bed, still in my travel-stained clothes, and let everything catch up to me. I'd done it. I'd returned to the place that had broken me, confronted the person who'd caused that breaking, and somehow come out the other side with something that looked almost like a happy ending. Or at least, the beginning of one. The ending was still waiting, decades away, but that felt manageable. distant enough to not be terrifying. I slept deeply and dreamlessly, the kind of sleep that comes from emotional exhaustion. When I awoke, I had no idea how much time had passed. The room was dark, lit only by moonlight streaming through the windows, which meant very little in a valley where it was always night. I got up, washed my face in the basin that had been provided, and changed into clean clothes from my pack. My stomach reminded me I hadn't eaten in far too long, and I remembered Sylvain mentioning food had been prepared. I found my way to a small dining room off the main hall, where indeed a meal had been laid out and kept warm through methods I didn't question. As I ate, I thought about what came next. The immediate crisis was resolved. Theron was awake. We'd talked. We'd acknowledged feelings and made tentative plans to try. But that was just the beginning. We had actual logistics to figure out. How would this work, practically speaking? How much time would I spend here versus at the monastery? What would I tell Brother Aldrich and the other monks? How would we navigate the fundamental differences between human and vampire life? I was still pondering these questions when I heard footsteps and looked up to find Theron in the doorway. He looked better than he had in his bed, still pale, still obviously recovering, but upright and steady. He'd changed clothes and clearly made an effort to appear more himself, though I could see the strain around his eyes. He asked if he could join me, and I gestured to the seat across from mine. We sat there for a moment in silence, the weight of everything we'd said and not said hanging between us. Finally, I spoke. We should probably talk about the practical aspects. I know we covered the emotional territory more or less, but there are real logistical questions about how this works. Always so practical, he said, but there was fondness in his voice, not criticism. That's one of the things I love. He stopped himself, like even now he was wary of saying it too often, making it too real. You can say it, I told him. We're past the point of pretending, aren't we? That's the whole point of trying again, and honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. I love that about you, he finished. How you can stand in the middle of extraordinary circumstances and still want to make lists and plan logistics. It's grounding. I need that, good, because I need to know what we're doing here. I can stay for a while, a few weeks, maybe a month. But I do have responsibilities at the monastery. Students who are depending on me, research that needs supervision. Obligations I can't just abandon. He nodded, understanding in his expression. He told me he wasn't asking me to abandon anything, that he knew my work was important, that he'd never want me to give up the life I'd built. He suggested that perhaps we could work out an arrangement. I could divide my time, spending parts of the year in Nocthaven and parts at the monastery. He said the valley would always be here, that he would always be here, that he'd waited 5 years and could wait through shorter separations if it meant having me in his life at all. The monastery isn't far, I said, thinking out loud. 2 weeks' travel, less if we find better routes. I could potentially come every few months, stay for extended periods during research seasons. And you, could you visit the capital? I know sunlight is an issue, but there are ways around that. Something flickered across his face, hesitation, maybe fear. He explained that leaving Nocthaven was complicated, that his presence here wasn't just residential, but tied to the valley's stability in ways he didn't fully understand himself. He said he'd tried leaving once, decades ago, and had felt physically ill the further he got from the mountains. He wasn't certain if it was psychological or something more fundamental, but either way, it meant he was more or less bound to this place. So I'll be the one traveling, I said, accepting this limitation. That's fine. I actually prefer having a base at the monastery anyway. The resources there are better for certain types of research. This can be my ... What would you call it? Secondary residence? Your home when you choose to be here? He offered. Not secondary, just different. I liked that framing better. 2 homes, 2 lives that would need to be woven together carefully. It wouldn't be easy. The separation alone would be difficult. But people maintained long-distance relationships. They managed. We would manage too, with the added complication that one of us didn't age and the other did, but one problem at a time. We talked through the night, working out details, identifying challenges, being honest about concerns. He worried about my safety traveling back and forth. I worried about the toll that repeated goodbyes would take. He pointed out that the valley's isolation might feel suffocating over time. I acknowledged that watching him remain unchanged while I aged would be psychologically difficult. Neither of us had perfect solutions, but we committed to being honest when problems arose, to not letting issues fester the way we'd both done before. As the conversation wound down, as we ran out of immediate logistics to discuss, a different tension entered the room. We'd talked about feelings, about practical arrangements, about the future in broad strokes, but we hadn't talked about what this relationship would actually look like day to day. Theron seemed to sense my uncertainty because he said quietly, his voice careful, that he wanted me to set the pace. He told me that he'd rushed nothing before, had kept careful distance, never touched me beyond the most formal contact, but for the wrong reasons. Now, he wanted to do it right, which meant giving me control. He said I should tell him what I was comfortable with, what I wanted, and that he'd follow my lead completely. I don't know what I want, I admitted. I feel like I'm 17 and navigating first romance, except I'm not, and this isn't a normal romance. I loved you from a distance before, built up this entire fantasy of what we might be together. But that was imagination. This is real, and I don't actually know how to navigate real with you. He smiled at that, a genuine smile that transformed his usually serious face. He told me that was fine, that we could figure it out together. He suggested we start simple, spend time together without pressure, relearn each other as we actually were, rather than as we'd imagined. He said that before we'd spend evenings together, we'd talked for hours, and maybe we should start there again. Rebuild the foundation, but this time with honesty underneath it. I'd like that, I said, though I'm keeping my own room, for now at least. I need space that's just mine, somewhere I can retreat when I need to think. Of course, this is your home when you're here. You shouldn't feel obligated to. He paused, seemed to be choosing words carefully. I want you to feel free here, Alara. To have your own space, your own routine, your own life that exists independently of me. I never want you to feel consumed by this. It was such a thoughtful thing to say, so different from the possessive declarations I'd read about in romance novels. But it was also very him-measured, careful, thinking about long-term sustainability rather than immediate passion. Part of me appreciated the consideration. Another part wondered if maybe we were being too careful, if we'd intellectualized ourselves into paralysis. I decided to be brave. I stood up, walked around the table to where he sat, and held out my hand. When he took it, I pulled him to his feet, and then, before I could overthink it, I kissed him. It wasn't perfect. Our heights weren't quite right, and I had to stretch up while he leaned down. He was cold, still recovering from his near death, and for a second he was so surprised he didn't react at all. But then his hand came up to cup my face, gentle and reverent, and he kissed me back with a tenderness that made my breath catch. When we pulled apart, his eyes were wide with surprise. "What was that for?" "For balance," I said. We were getting too caught up in being reasonable and careful. Sometimes you have to just act, just feel, without planning every detail first. I see. But he was smiling, that rare, genuine smile. Should I expect more spontaneous acts of imbalance? Probably. I'm not very good at the measured, controlled approach. You'll have to get used to that. I think I can manage, he said, and there was warmth in his voice that I'd never heard before. Not the careful, controlled warmth he'd shown me in our previous interactions, but something real and unguarded. We stayed like that for a moment, just standing close, his hand still on my face, my hand still holding his. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming. It was just Nice. Comfortable. Real. The next few weeks fell into a pattern that felt surprisingly normal. I'd wake late, given the odd sleep schedule that the eternal twilight encouraged. I'd work in the mornings or, what passed for them, documenting specimens, writing up research notes, corresponding with the monastery about my extended stay. Theron would join me in the afternoons and we'd walk through the valley together, him showing me sights I'd missed in my first visit, me explaining the intricacies of plant biology with the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a genuinely interested audience. Evenings we'd spend in the library, reading sometimes, talking others. He taught me about the valley's history, about the generations of vampires who'd lived there, about the delicate ecosystem that sustained life in the absence of the sun. I taught him about new developments in botanical science, about classification systems he'd never heard of, about the monastery's latest discoveries. And slowly, carefully, we learned to touch each other. Nothing dramatic, a hand on the small of my back as we walked, his fingers brushing mine as we reached for the same book, my head resting on his shoulder as we sat together. Small intimacies that built trust, that taught us what this physical relationship might look like. We had our first real argument 3 weeks into my stay. I'd mentioned potentially staying longer, extending my visit another month, and he'd immediately discouraged it. He told me I needed to return to the monastery, maintain my obligations, not let my life there deteriorate because of our relationship. I'd gotten angry, asking him if he was trying to push me away again, if this was another version of his self-protective distancing. He'd gotten frustrated in return, explaining that he was trying to protect my career, my independence, the things that made me who I was. We'd raised our voices well, I'd raised mine. He'd gotten icily controlled, and I'd stormed out I room. I'd expected him to leave me alone, to let me cool off, but 20 minutes later, there was a knock on my door. When I opened it, he was standing there with a peace offering, a specimen of a plant I'd been searching for, carefully preserved in a collection case. He apologized for being controlling, for trying to manage my decisions rather than trusting me to balance my own priorities. I apologized for assuming the worst, for not trusting that his concern came from care rather than rejection. We talked it through, established better communication patterns, and made up. It was such a normal relationship moment, mundane even. And that's when I realized that despite everything extraordinary about our circumstances, what we were building was actually quite ordinary. 2 people learning to be together, making mistakes, figuring out how to navigate differences. The fact that one of us was a vampire and the other human, that we were separated by centuries and incompatible lifespans, almost felt secondary to the basic work of being in a relationship. Almost. The reality of our difference hit me one evening when we were in the garden. I'd been transplanting some specimens, my hands dirty with soil, and I'd nicked my finger on a thorn. Just a small cut, barely worth noticing. But Theron had gone completely still, his entire body tensing, his eyes fixed on the small bead of blood welling up on my finger. I'd frozen too, suddenly remembering what he was, what that blood meant to him. We'd been so comfortable together, so normal, that I'd almost forgotten the fundamental nature of his existence. He'd excused himself immediately, his voice strained, and he'd disappeared into the castle for the rest of the night. I'd cleaned and bandaged the cut, feeling shaken. Not because I thought he'd hurt me, I didn't, not really, but because it was a sharp reminder that there were complications here that couldn't be resolved through communication and compromise. He'd apologized the next day, looking exhausted. He explained that he had perfect control under normal circumstances, that I was never in danger. But the surprise of it, the sudden scent of fresh blood when he wasn't prepared, had caught him off guard. He told me that he fed regularly from livestock that the castle maintained, that he never took from humans, that he hadn't for decades. But Instinct was still instinct, and my blood had called to him in a way that had terrified them both. We established new boundaries after that. I'd be more careful when working with plants. He'd make sure he was well fed before spending time with me. We'd be honest if situations felt risky. It was another layer of complication to navigate, but we managed it. The weeks turned into a month, then 2. I wrote to Brother Aldrich, explaining that I'd found extensive new research opportunities and requesting an extended leave. He'd written back with approval but also gentle concern, asking if everything was all right, if I needed anything. I'd reassured him without going into details about what or who was keeping me in the valley, but I knew I couldn't stay indefinitely. My students needed me. My research projects at the monastery required supervision, and truthfully, as much as I loved being with Theron, I was starting to feel the isolation. The valley was beautiful. The castle was comfortable, but I missed the bustle of the capital, the community of scholars, the diversity of normal human life. I brought it up one evening, telling Theron that I thought it was time for me to return for a while. I could see the fear flash across his face, the immediate worry that return for a while meant I was leaving for good. But I explained my thinking that our arrangement would work better if I maintained both lives rather than trying to transplant entirely into his. That I'd come back in a few months, stay for another extended visit, and we'd build a pattern of presence and absence that honored both our needs. He'd agreed, intellectually understanding even as emotionally struggling. He asked me when I was thinking of leaving, and I told him I'd give it another week. Time to finish current projects, prepare specimens to take back, say proper goodbyes. That final week was bittersweet. Every moment felt weighted with awareness that separation was coming. We spent more time together, talked more deeply, held on to each other a little tighter. And one night, 3 days before I was set to leave, our carefully maintained physical boundaries shifted. I won't detail everything. Some moments are private, even in telling a story. But I'll say that we finally moved beyond careful kisses and tentative touches to something deeper. And it was both wonderful and terrifying. Intimate in ways that went beyond physical. Complicated by all the differences between us, but beautiful despite them. Afterward, lying in his bed with his arms around me, I'd cried. Not from regret or pain, but from the overwhelming awareness of what we had and how temporary it was. He'd held me, understanding without needing explanation, sharing that grief even as we existed in the joy of the present moment. I wish things were different, I'd whispered. I wish we had more time. He'd pressed his lips to my temple, his voice quiet in the darkness. We have exactly the time we have, not more, not less. And I'll take every moment of it, grateful, even knowing how it ends. The day I left, half the castle seemed to be involved in seeing me off. Sylvain had packed supplies for my journey, far more than I needed. Other members of Theron's household, vampires I'd gradually gotten to know over my stay, offered their goodbyes and safe travels. It was strangely touching, being seen off by these ancient creatures who'd accepted my presence in their lord's life. Theron walked me to the edge of the valley as far as he could go comfortably. We stood at the boundary between his world and mine, the mountains rising ahead of me, the shadowed valley behind. I'll write, I promised. Every week, detailed letters about everything. Research, monastery gossip, whatever trivial thoughts cross my mind. You'll probably get sick of hearing from me. Impossible, he said. Write me novels if you want. I'll read every word. And I'll be back. 3 months, maybe 4. As soon as I can arrange another leave, I'll count the days. He said it like a promise, like a vow. We kissed goodbye, both of us trying not to make it more dramatic than it needed to be. But when I finally pulled away and started up the mountain path, I had to force myself not to look back. If I did, I might not have the strength to keep walking. The journey back to the monastery gave me time to think, to process everything that had happened. I'd gone to Knockhaven expecting closure, one way or another. What I'd found instead was a beginning, messy and complicated, and probably doomed, but real. So beautifully, painfully real. The monastery welcomed me back with genuine pleasure. Brother Aldrich took one look at me and smiled knowingly, telling me I looked different. Happier, maybe. Or perhaps just more settled, more comfortable in my own skin. I didn't tell him about Theron, not everything. But I gave him enough to understand that I'd found something important in that valley, something worth the complication of maintaining. I fell back into my routine, teaching, research, community life. But now there was correspondence with Knockhaven woven through it. True to my word, I wrote Theron long letters about everything and nothing, and he wrote back, his letters arriving regularly, filled with observations about the valley, thoughts on books he was reading, small stories about daily life that made me smile. 3 months later, I made my second journey back to Knockhaven, and then another 3 months after that, and again, and again. A pattern established itself, seasons at the monastery interspersed with extended visits to the valley. Neither place was fully home, but together they created something that felt complete. Years passed this way. 5, then 10, then 15. I aged visibly and measurably, while Theron remained exactly as he'd always been. It was strange, sometimes painful, watching my reflection change while his stayed constant. But it was also grounding, a physical reminder that our time was finite, that every visit mattered, that nothing could be taken for granted. We had arguments, of course. Periods of difficulty where the distance felt too great or the differences too stark. Times when I resented his immortality or he struggled with my mortality. But we worked through them, committed to choosing each other despite the complications. The monastery eventually learned about Theron, though most thought he was simply a wealthy patron who supported my research. A few knew the truth. Brother Aldrich certainly did, though he never commented directly. He simply made sure I had the support I needed to maintain both lives. My students grew and graduated, some becoming researchers in their own right. My work gained recognition in botanical circles. I published papers, contributed to archives, built a legacy that would outlast me. And through all of it, they're not physically present for most of it, but they're in letters, in the knowledge that I had a place to return to, someone who loved me across all the complications. I'm 45 now writing this. Not old by most standards, but definitely no longer young. There are lines around my eyes, silver threading through my hair, aches in my joints that weren't there before. 20 years have passed since that night I overheard Theron's cruel words. 15 since I returned and we began this strange, beautiful attempt at something real. I'm at the monastery currently between visits to Knockhaven. My next trip is planned for 2 months from now, and I'll stay through the winter season, working on a comprehensive botanical documentation project that Theron and I have been planning for years. I don't know how many more of these cycles we'll have. My body reminds me increasingly that time is not infinite, that the ending we've always known was coming is getting closer. Maybe I have another 20 years, maybe 30 if I'm lucky. And then Theron will have centuries to remember me, to carry what we built together into a future I can't even imagine. That should be terrifying. In some ways, it is. But mostly, I find it comforting. I'll live beyond my body's limit through his memory, through the impact I've had on him and the valley and the work we've done together. I'll be immortalized, not in grand gestures or dramatic sacrifice, but in the small, ordinary moments that made up our life together. The evening conversations, the walks through moonlit gardens, the letters exchanged across distance, the choice to keep choosing each other despite every reason not to. I think about that girl who walked into Knockhaven 15 years ago, carrying a dying lily and a broken heart. She was so certain that love meant being everything to someone, meant permanence and possession and never having to say goodbye. She had no idea that real love might mean something different, might mean cycles of presence and absence, might mean holding on while letting go, might mean building something beautiful, knowing it will end. I don't regret what happened, not anymore. Not the initial heartbreak, not the years of pain, not even Theron's cruel words that sent me away. Because all of it led to this: a life lived fully in two worlds, a love that exists despite impossibility. A story that doesn't have a happy ending, but has countless happy moments along the way. The darkness didn't destroy me. It tested me, shaped me, and taught me that I was strong enough to love someone I'd eventually lose. And when I did lose myself to that darkness for a while, when I walked away from Nocthaven, convinced I meant nothing, the darkness somehow remembered me in ways the light never had. Theron remembered me. Not because I was extraordinary or irreplaceable, or the only one who'd ever mattered to him, though he claims all those things in his letters, but because connection, real connection, leaves marks that don't fade even when the people do. I marked him by being fully, authentically myself in his presence. He marked me by showing me what it meant to be seen, to be valued, to be loved, despite all the logical reasons why it shouldn't work. And so we continue. Separate and together, temporary and eternal, human and vampire, learning that sometimes the most beautiful things grow in the shadows. Not in spite of the darkness, but because of it. Because darkness teaches us to appreciate light when we have it, to hold tight to warmth, knowing it won't last forever, to bloom brilliantly in the brief time we're given. I'll return to Nocthaven in 2 months. Theron will be waiting, unchanged as always, and we'll fall back into our pattern. We'll work together in the gardens, discuss books in the library, hold each other in the darkness, and pretend that time isn't moving forward. We'll live in the present moment as fully as we can, knowing that every moment is both precious and finite. And when my end finally comes, whether it's in 20 years or 30 or tomorrow, I'll face it knowing I lived fully. Not perfectly, not without pain, but fully. I loved and was loved in return. I built something meaningful in the spaces between light and dark. I proved to myself that I could survive heartbreak and choose to risk it again. The moonshade lily blooms once every century and dies within hours, but in those hours it's more beautiful than anything the eternal darkness has ever seen. It doesn't apologize for its brevity. It just blooms, brilliant and brief, and leaves those who witness it forever changed. I was born into light, but I learned to live in darkness, and in that darkness, I found someone who recognized me. Someone who saw my small, temporary human life and decided it was worth loving anyway, despite the inevitable pain. Someone who taught me that being an echo isn't a diminishment. Sometimes being an echo means you've made a sound powerful enough to persist long after the original voice has faded. The shadows remembered me, and I'll remember them, carry them with me until the very end. And then, in whatever way consciousness continues, if it continues at all, I'll still carry this truth. I mattered. To him, to myself, to the small corner of the world we shared. And that mattering doesn't diminish just because it eventually ends. So this is my story. Not a fairy tale with a neat resolution. Not a tragedy, though it contains tragedy. Just a love story that happened despite every reasonable objection, that persisted through separation and difference, and the fundamental impossibility of forever. A story about a botanist and a vampire, about moonlight and shadows, about choosing to bloom even when you know the frost is coming. I started this account thinking I'd document what happened for some objective record, some clinical analysis of how two incompatible beings tried and failed to overcome their differences. But as I write these final words, I realize that's not what this is at all. This is a love letter. To Theron, yes, who will read this someday after I'm gone and hopefully understand what he meant to me, what we built together. But also to myself, to the girl who walked into darkness with hope in her heart, to the woman who survived having that hope crushed, to the person I became who was brave enough to try again. And maybe it's a love letter to anyone who's ever stood at the edge of something impossible and thought about walking away. To anyone who's been hurt and had to decide whether to risk hurt again. To anyone who's loved something temporary and wondered if the inevitable ending made the whole thing pointless. It doesn't. The ending doesn't make it pointless. The ending just makes it real. I have a trip to plan, supplies to organize, specimens to prepare for transport. In 2 months, I'll walk back into that valley of eternal twilight, and Theron will be waiting for me. We'll have our weeks or months together, and then I'll leave again, and the cycle will continue until one day it can't anymore. And I'll take every moment of it grateful and present and fully alive. Because I learned something in those shadows that I couldn't have learned anywhere else. I learned that being temporary doesn't mean being insignificant. That being an echo means you made a sound worth repeating. That being remembered is its own kind of forever and maybe the only kind that really matters. The darkness nearly destroyed me, but it didn't. Instead, it taught me how to bloom in impossible conditions, how to find light in the absence of the sun, how to love when every logical reason says you shouldn't. And when people ask me, as they occasionally do, the ones who know enough to be curious, if I regret it, if I wish I'd chosen someone human, someone whose life would align with mine in predictable ways, I always tell them the same thing. I wish we had more time. I'll always wish that. But I don't wish for different time, or different circumstances, or a different person. I wish for more of exactly what we have, exactly as it is, with all its complications and impossibilities and inevitable heartbreak. Because all of this, the joy and the pain, the presence and the absence, the choosing and being chosen, this is love. Real, messy, imperfect, finite love. And it's the most beautiful thing I've ever cultivated. More beautiful than the moonshade lily that blooms once a century. More rare than any specimen I've ever documented. More precious than any discovery I could make. So I'll return to the shadows. Not because I'm lost, not because I'm running from light, but because the shadows remember me, and I remember them. And somewhere, in that mutual recognition, we found something worth keeping. Even if we can't keep it forever, especially because we can't keep it forever. The moons are rising outside my window now, different moons than the ones in Nochthaven, but still beautiful in their own way. And I find myself thinking about him, as I often do at this hour, wondering what he's doing, if he's thinking of me too, knowing that in 2 months I'll find out, and we'll have our time together again. And that's enough. More than enough. It's everything.